Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a custom VPC, create subnet, deploy EC2 instances in those subnet, and then remotely connect to those EC2 instances. All right. So we are going to be using AWS Cloud. Our VPC will be created in US East 1 region. We'll use this CIDR as our IP version 4 CIDR for our VPC. We will create 3 subnet, 1 public subnet and 2 private subnet. In the public subnet, we will deploy an EC2 instance called Bastion Host. And in the private subnet, we will deploy 2 private instances in each subnet. All right. From our local, we will connect to our Bastion host, and then from our Bastion host, we will connect to our private server. So let's go to our AWS account and start the demo. Now, I'm already logged into my AWS account, and here is my AWS management console. So under recently visited services, you should see VPC. If you don't already have VPC, go here and type VPC. So this should bring VPC up, hit on VPC under services, and then go to your VPCs. Just make sure you are in your preferred region, okay? I'm in North Virginia, and that's where I want my VPC to be created. So I'll go to create VPC, and then I'll put my VPC name as custom VPC. Then under IP version 4 CIDR, I will go to my architecture diagram and make sure I use 172.31.0.0/32. So let's go and type that in here, 172.31.0.0/24. Sorry, 20, okay? 20. Then I will leave every other thing by default and hit create VPC. This should create my VPC, okay? Go back to your VPC and make sure you have your VPC created with your required CIDR block. Now, let's go back to our architecture diagram. We have created our VPC with this IP version 4 CIDR. Now, the next thing we need to do is to create our public subnet. Let's head back to our VPC dashboard. So hit on subnet, then do create subnet. Then under VPC ID, select the ID of your custom VPC that you just created. Give your subnet a name, and I'll call this public subnet. Public subnet -01. Then I will choose my preferred availability zone. And according to my architecture, we are going to deploy this subnet in US East 1C, right? You can use any availability zone of your choice, okay? And then the CIDR of this subnet is going to be 172.31.0.0/23. So I'm going to put that CIDR here, 172.31.0.0/23, and I will hit create subnet, right? That should create my public subnet. Now, I'll hit back on subnet to make sure my subnet is created with this name, and then go back to the architecture, go to this other section of the architecture, and the next thing we need to create is the first private subnet, and we'll be creating that in US East 1, and that subnet will have this CIDR. Then we'll call it control plane subnet, okay? So let's go back here, hit on create subnet. Under VPC ID, select your VPC ID, and I'll call this control plane. Let's call that control plane, okay? Control-plane. And then under this, select your preferred availability zone to be this, and then we'll put 172.0.31.2.0/23. Let's make sure we have that input correctly, right? So now we'll leave every other thing by default and hit on create subnet. Now our control plane subnet is created. Now we need to create the last subnet, which is the data plane subnet, okay? So let's hit on the VPC ID and select your custom VPC ID. Give your subnet a name, and we'll call this data-plane. Data-plane, all right? So this is going to be created in US East 1B, and we'll give 172.31.4.0/23 as that subnet network side. So 172.31.4.0/23. Leave every other thing by default and hit on create subnet. All right, now we have completed the creation of our VPC and our 3 subnet, which is 1 public subnet and 2 private subnet. All right, now the next thing we need to do is to create what is called route table. We need to create 2 route tables. One route table will be for public subnet and another one will be for private subnet. All right, let's go ahead and hit on create route and hit on route table, then do create route tables. Let's call this public -RT. Okay, under VPC, select your VPC ID and hit on create route table. Now that's for public subnet. All right, now let's go back to our route table and hit again on create route table. Let's put this private route table. Now select again your custom VPC and hit on create route table. Right, so this creates our private route table. So we now have these 2 route tables. Now the next thing is we need to go and associate our private subnet to our private route table and public subnet to our public route table. Okay, so let's hit on the private route table ID, and we are going to do subnet association. Go do edit subnet and then pick your private subnet. Remember, we created our 2 private subnet called control plane and data plane, and then do save association. So that will associate our private subnet to our private route table. Okay, now let's head back to our route tables, and on the public route table ID, hit on this. Make sure you are seeing your public route table here. Okay, now go edit route table. Go click on subnet association, do edit subnet association, choose your public subnet, okay, and then do save subnet association. So go back to your route table just to verify and make sure you have everything associated correctly. Now, this is your public route table. You can see that you have only 1 public subnet associated with that. And then on your private route table, you should have 2 subnets. So if you hover your cursor on this, you should see that you have your control plane and your data plane subnet, which are your private subnet associated to that, okay? All right, so the next thing we need to do is to create an internet gateway. An internet gateway is a VPC component that will be assigned or attached to our route table to enable our connection to the server. And of course, to enable our server to be able to pull data from the internet. Okay, in case we need to update our server or install any other software on our server. All right, so let's head over to Internet Gateway and hit on Create Internet Gateway. Let's give it a name, and I'll call it Public-Internet Gateway. Okay, and I'll hit on Create Internet Gateway. Now, once our Internet Gateway is created, what we need to do is attach our VPC to this gateway. That way, our gateway will know where to route their traffic. Okay, now let's go to action and click on the drop down button in front of action and do attach to VPC. And then we are going to go here and see our VPC that we created. There is one thing I want to let you know here, that an internet gateway only gets attached to one VPC. You cannot attach more than one internet gateway to a VPC, okay? So let's do attach internet gateway. So that should attach our internet gateway to our VPC. And the next thing we need to do is to go back to our route table. Now, on our public route table, we are going to hit on the public route table ID, and we will go to edit route, and under destination, we will hit on add route. We will take 0.0.0/0 to be our destination. That is the internet, right? We will navigate to the internet gateway and select the internet gateway that we just created and do save changes, right? That should add the route from the internet to our server, okay? Now, the next thing we need to do is create EC2 instances, deploy EC2 instances to those various subnets. Now, let's go back to our architecture and review that. So, in the public subnet, we are going to create an EC2 instance, while in the private subnet, two private subnets, we will deploy EC2 instances each in those private subnets, all right? So let's head over to our AWS Management Console and do that. Now, we will go here and type EC2 and hit on this EC2 under services. So we will create on instances, click on instances and do launch instances. Now, once this is populated, what you need to do is type the name of your EC2. So we'll be calling this Bastion Host. Bastion-host, right? Just the way we have it on the diagram, we'll call this EC2 instance Bastion Host, right? So we will navigate down to AMI section, and I'll be using Ubuntu for this demo. Now, I will leave everything under instant type by default, and then I will go hit on create new key pair because I want to use a new key pair for this. I will call it custom-key-pair, okay? I'll call it custom-key-pair, then I'll leave every other thing by default, and I'll hit on create key pair. Now, that key pair should be downloaded and, of course, mounted to my EC2 profile. Now, under network settings, I'll go and hit on edit. Then on the drop-down button in front of my default VPC, I'll hit on that and select my custom VPC, right? Now, I have created a public subnet, right, called public-subnet, which is this subnet. I'll pick that subnet and make sure I enable public IP address to be assigned to this. Okay, I want a public IP address to be assigned to it because with that public IP address, I'll be able to securely connect to my EC2 instance, and then from my EC2 instance, I would jump to my EC2 instance in my private subnet. All right, these EC2 instances in the private subnet are in other words called private servers because I cannot be able to remotely access those EC2 instances from my local, but I can do that from my Bastion host. That's why we are creating a Bastion host in the public subnet. All right. Now let's head over back to our AWS Management Console under EC2 dashboard. Now, the next thing to do here is to create a security group. I'm going to create a new security group, and I'll call that security group Bastion. Bastion host -SG. Okay, I'll call it SG. I just want to call it SG. SG means security group. And I'll say use this to remotely access my Bastion host, right? Now, under source type, I'm going to go and select my source type to be my IP. So this will be my public IP address. And I will just go ahead and cross-check to make sure everything is correct. Once everything is correct, I'll go and hit on launch instance. So that should create my Bastion Host instance, okay, or server. Now, once that is created, I'll head over to EC2. Just refresh this to make sure it's getting created. So if you see this, it is on the initializing status, right? So let's go and click on launch instance again. So the next thing we need to do is to create our first private instance in our control plane subnet, right? So let's go back to our EC2 dashboard, and I'll call this private server -01, okay? -01. I'll use Ubuntu AMI, and I'll leave everything by default under instant type. I will pick the same key pair I just used for the Bastion host, use this same key pair, then make sure under network settings, go click on edit, select your custom VPC, and then remember we are creating this in this subnet. We call this subnet control plane. This is our first subnet, all right? We'll go ahead and make sure we are using that subnet, all right? Then make sure you disable the public IP address to be assigned to this, because we don't want an auto assign public IP address to this. We want our EC2 instance to be completely private in a private subnet. Now we will create a security group for those two private instances, right? So we'll call this private-sg for those two private instances. Then I will pass a description here as use this to access private servers. All right. Now in here, let me just limit this to a custom IP, okay? But I'm going to leave this like this, and I'll hit on launch instance, because I'll come back and modify my this firewall rule, okay? And then I'll hit on launch instance. All right, it needs me to put an IP address, but guess what I'm going to do here? I'll put the IP address, the CIDR block of my entire VPC. That way, my EC2 instances will be able to connect to that, because they are going to be in the same network. So this is the CIDR block of my VPC. So I will go ahead and type that in here. So which is 172.31.0.0/20. Okay, let's verify and make sure we have that CIDR block correctly input in there. So you can verify that to make sure you have it correctly. All right, so let's go here and hit on launch instance. That should launch your first private subnet. This is your first private instance in your private subnet. All right. Go back to instances, do a refresh to make sure your EC2 instance is getting created. Now, the next thing we need to do is to launch the last EC2 instance in our second private subnet, and we'll call that instance private server -02. Let's call it private server -02. Now, I'll be using Ubuntu as my image. I will leave everything by default under instant type. So I'll go ahead and pick the same key pair I used for the last two instances. Still under network settings, we are going to select our custom VPC, and then make sure you are using the data plane subnet, because that is your last subnet ID. Okay, we'll use that one, and we'll make sure that we disable auto assign public IP address to that instance. Now, we will use the same security group that we created earlier for the private subnet, which is private security group, and then we'll hit on launch instance. You can verify this to make sure that you have everything correctly configured, right? So let's click on launch instance to create our last instance. Now, we have this setup done. Now, the next step we need to do here is to remotely connect to our Bastion host. Then from our Bastion host, we will jump to our private instances. Before we do that, let's evaluate our Bastion host. So this is my Bastion host. You can see that it has a public IP address assigned to it, right? It has this public IP address. And I will be using this public IP address with key pair and the username of this server to remotely access this EC2 instance. Now let's go to our first private instance. You can see that the private server 01 does not have a public IP address because we vehemently told our server, during our configuration, not to auto-assign a public IP address to it because we want our EC2 instance not to be able to be accessed publicly. We want to be able to access this only when we are on our Bastion host, all right? So same thing should apply to this second server. You can see that it doesn't have any public IP address, okay? So we have created this Bastion host. We created our first subnet, our first EC2 instance, which is called private-server 01, which is this EC2 instance, this subnet, and the other one is this subnet, right? Both of them don't have public IP address. Now let's go and see how we can remotely connect to our Bastion host. Now to do that, I'm going to pull my command line interface. Let's pull my command line interface, and my key pair was downloaded to my download folder. So I will navigate to my download folder. So let me do cd. In fact, let me copy my key pair to a secure location. All right. So I'll do cp, then my download folder, and then I'll pass the name of my key pair. I'll copy it to my SSH location. All right. So in my SSH location, I will then change. If I do ls, you should see that my key pair has both read and write permission. So I don't want my key pair to have read and write permission for this user. What I need to do is make my key pair to have only read permission. So to do that, I'm going to pass this command chmod 400. Then I'll pass my key pair name. Okay. So that should change my permission to only read. You can see that my key pair only have read permission. Now, to connect to my EC2 instance, I need to go get the public IP address and the username. So let me show you how to get the username of this server. The username of this server should be here. All right, you can see that the username is Ubuntu. Okay, so you can go back to SSH client, then just copy this command, go back to your terminal, paste this, and hit enter. This should prompt you to say yes or no. Okay, type yes and hit enter. So you should be connected to your EC2 instance. Okay, once in your EC2 instance, run sudo apt update -y. All right, that should update your instance. All right, let's wait for the update to be done. All right, guys, now our update is done. The next thing we can do is to upgrade our service or our patches in the server. But I'm not going to do that right now. But I want to do something to differentiate my servers. Okay, so you can see that my server has this host name, and I want to change that host name to Bastion host. That way I can separate my server from one another, right? So to change that, I'm going to do sudo hostname ctr set hostname. Okay, set hostname. I will call it Bastion. Bastion-host. Let me call it Bastion-host. So if I exit out of this server and log in back, you should see that I'm now having a host name as Bastion host instead of this IP address, that private IP address. All right. So now we have connected to our Bastion host from our local. So this is our Bastion host. We have remotely connected to our Bastion host from our local. Now, once we are in our Bastion host, we will then connect to our EC2 instances in our private subnet, because these EC2 instances in the private subnet don't have public IP address. That is why we cannot connect to them directly from our local. All right. Now, to do that, what we need to do is to copy the key pair we created into this Bastion host, because without that, we will not be able to connect to it. So let's go ahead and copy our key pair to this Bastion host. Now I will exit from this location, and then I will type cat, and then pass the key pair, the key pair name. So this should display the content of my key pair, and I'll copy it to my clipboard, log back to my EC2 instance. I want to put this key pair in a secure location. Okay, I'll do VI. You can use any text editor tool that you like to create a server. I mean, a file. Okay, and I'll call this key pair custom-key. And I'll hit enter. So let me paste this. Let me paste that. Save my key pair or my file. Then navigate to my SSH location. Do ls. I should see my key pair name in there. So if I do ls-la, my key pair should have read-write permission, and that's what I don't want. I want my key pair to only have read permission, and we will do the same thing we did earlier in our local. So what we need to do is to type shmoth 400 and then our key pair name custom, right? So we can do a list again. We can see now that the permissions have changed to read only. Now, let's navigate back to our architecture and see the next thing we need to do. So the next thing we need to do is to SSH to this EC2 instance. The name of this EC2 instance is called private-server1. All right, so we need to go back to our AWS management console or the EC2 instance dashboard, then go click on this guy, because that EC2 instance is this particular EC2 instance in the data plane subnet. Now, what we need to do here is to copy the private IP address, or you can go to this connect string, copy this, then navigate back to your control plane, your Bastion host, paste this, and hit enter. But this is not going to connect because our key pair is wrongly typed. So I'll do a list to make sure I have the name of my key pair correctly defined here. So I'll hit enter. Right? That should take me directly to my private server. So we are connected already to this server, and let me change the host name. So I'll do sudo hostname ctr. I'll set the host name to private server. Let me call it private-server-01. Okay. Now let's exit back out and log back in. Okay. So we have connected to our first private server. Now let's exit and go and connect to our second subnet server. Okay. Now from our Bastion host, we would then connect again to this second server. All right. Now let's go back to our AWS, to our EC2 dashboard, copy this IP address, go back to your terminal, call back this command. You can paste this, the IP address of your second server, paste that IP address, paste the IP address, hit enter. That is not getting created. So okay, we don't have it correctly set up. So let me put a 51 and do yes. Now that should take us to our second server. So I still have to change the host name again. Sudo hostname ctl set dash hostname, and I'll call it private dash server dash 02. Okay, where do I have a typos? Hostname ctl, right? Another way you can do to make sure your hostname has changed is to put bash, then do hostname, hit enter, right? You should see the hostname of your server. Now let's try to do something that I want to show you. Okay, so we have these EC2 instances in this private subnet, but these servers are not able to reach the internet. There is nothing you can download from the internet, because if you try to update this instance, for example, if you try to run sudo apt update, see, look at what is going to happen. Okay, they are not able to reach to the internet because there is no gateway letting them to get to the internet. So what we need to do to solve this problem is to create what is called a NAT gateway and then assign it to the public subnet, then add it to our public route table. That way, these EC2 instances will be able to connect to the internet and then pull data. All right. Now let's go to our AWS management console under VPC dashboard and do that configuration. So here is our AWS EC2 instance profile or dashboard. I'm going to duplicate this and we will go back to our VPC dashboard. So go back here, type VPC, click on the VPC, then go hit on NAT Gateway. Now, under this, you should not see any NAT Gateway, okay? If you don't already have one, do create NAT Gateway. Now, let's call it public-NAT, okay? And then I will select the subnet. Of course, this is going to be my public IP address. The public IP address we created earlier was called public-subnet, okay? Sorry, the public subnet we created earlier was called public-subnet, and I'll select that subnet and then allocate an elastic IP address, because you will need an elastic IP address to attach to this gateway. That way, your EC2 instance will be able to reach the internet. All right. So let's allocate an elastic IP address to it and hit on create NAT. So that should begin our NAT creation. So navigate back to the NAT. You should see your NAT is pending. Now, while we wait for this to create, let's navigate back to our route table. Go to public route table. Under edit route, hit on edit route, do add route, select your route from the internet. This route is the internet route, okay? Remember earlier, we selected a gateway, but now we are not going to select the gateway again. What we need to select is NAT, okay? We'll select the NAT, and then we'll choose the ID of the NAT that we just created, and then we'll hit on Save Changes. All right, so you can see there was an error editing route. All changes have been reverted because our route, our NAT gateway is still under creation. So we need to wait till our NAT is available. So let's go to our VPC, go hit on NAT Gateway, and you see our NAT is pending. So we need to wait till it is available before we do that changes. All right. All right, guys. You can see that our NAT is available. You can refresh this to make sure your NAT is available. Now head back to your route table. Make sure you are on your private route table. Earlier, I said you should do this configuration on that public route table, but rather do it on private route table, all right? Sorry for that confusion. So now I'm going to click on my private route table ID, and on this edit route, I will hit on edit route. Now I'll add a route from the internet, and of course, I will select a NAT gateway. So we'll use the NAT gateway we just created to allocate this route. Okay, so let's save the change. And of course, we can now go back to our terminal and test update to see if our EC2 instance will be able to reach the internet. And before we do that, let's check the log images, the log messages on this. So somewhere here you can see that it's telling you they had a 101, and this is saying that network is unreachable. Okay, it cannot initiate the connection to whatever this string it is. Of course, I'm assuming that that is the private DNS of that subnet. All right. Now, let's log back to our private EC2 instance. Okay. So let's log back to our Bastion host. So what we need to do is log back to this Bastion host. Let's connect to it first. So we are going to connect to that Bastion host with this public IP address. So let me go back to EC2 dashboard. This is EC2 dashboard. We will select our Bastion host, and we will do connect, and we'll copy this string, go to our terminal, paste this, and hit enter. No search file. It says no search file. Sorry, we are in our Bastion host already. Okay, guys, this is not local. So let me begin from the local. So let's hit enter. This is connecting from our local to our Bastion host. What we have just done is to connect from our local to our Bastion host. Now, in the Bastion host, we will connect from our Bastion host to the first server, private server. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my EC2 dashboard, select my first private instance, then copy this string, then go back here, paste this. Remember, we need to remove this because our key pair here is just custom dash key. Hit enter. What do I have wrong here? All right, let me do ls in here to make sure we are not in the same in our SSH location. So let's call back that command. Now this should connect us to our private subnet. All right, now we are in our private subnet. What we can do to make sure to test if our EC2 instance is able to reach the internet is to issue an update command. Sudo apt update -1. So you should see now that our EC2 instance is able to reach the internet. Okay, our EC2 instance in the private subnet is able to reach the internet. So guys, this is how you have this setup done. Please, if you find this video helpful, don't hesitate to subscribe to this YouTube